10 minutes. Okay. Ooh, wrong one. See, I already started making mistakes. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Rick Jewell. So I am an executive assistant with Aurora Mental Health Center, and I will be acting as the moderator for today's webinar. This is our fourth webinar in this series. However, I'm no expert, so I do apologize for any glitches or technical difficulties that should arise. I did want to let you know that I have muted and stopped the video feed for all participants in order for all of us to focus on the presenter, as well as to protect your individual privacy. This webinar is being recorded and will be utilized for both the Aurora Chamber of Commerce and Aurora Mental Health Center's internal and external audiences in order to continue supporting our community during this challenging time. To further protect your individual privacy, each of you have the ability to click on the 3 dots on the upper right hand of your individual screens and then rename yourself, or even just put in ... in place of that if you would like. When we get to the question and answer section during the last 10 to 20 minutes of today's webinar, if you would please direct all questions to me, Rick Jewell, via the chat privately, then I will state the question to the presenter for all to hear at that time. This will promote more privacy as to who is asking the question, if you like. If you choose to keep your name visible, that is completely fine. And if you choose to wish me to unmute your audio so that you can ask the question directly, please state so in your private chat message, and I'll be happy to do so at the time and let you ask the question directly. Just for those of you who don't know, the chat feature is found at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and it will open up a chat feature box to the right, which automatically defaults to everyone. And you can change that drop down from everyone to say my name, Rick Jewell. That way you can send me the questions privately. And you may go ahead and send questions to me throughout the presentation. However, they will not be asked until the Q&A time at the end of the presentation. So at this point in time, I'm going to introduce you all to the amazing and incredibly kind Catherine Dunn from Aurora Mental Health Center, who has agreed to be our presenter today. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here and for having me. I'm excited to be here. Something that I'm passionate about in all times is just understanding our behaviors and reactions, both our own and others, through a lens of stress and trauma responses. Because I think a byproduct of that understanding is compassion, and from that place we're able to be much more helpful. And that feels especially important right now. This current pandemic is stressful for everyone and traumatizing and re-traumatizing for many. Both the degree of threat that we're experiencing and our responses to that is dependent on a whole lot of factors, and we'll talk more about that, but including our social conditions, our own personal histories, our access to resources and support. So I'm just excited to be here to explore this topic and explore the implications of trauma specific to the context of our current pandemic. And before we dive in, I want to start with just a brief practice to bring us into our own bodies and our own experiences, as we're going to be talking throughout this about how we're being impacted, how other people are being impacted. So go ahead and find a comfortable seat, or if you're standing or laying down, that's totally fine too. And start by just shifting your awareness from your thinking mind to the felt sense of your body. So you might do that through noticing temperature, any areas of warmth or coolness, or noticing any sensation, any tension, tightness, tingling, itching, maybe noticing your heartbeat, your lungs. And take a moment to scan your physical body and wherever possible, release any areas of obvious tension or tightness. Just soften a little bit. And then shift your awareness to your breath. And just your natural breath as it is, so without altering anything, just start to become aware of your inhales and exhales.
Don't make me relax too much, Catherine. I'm the
Yeah, so make sure you're in a position that's both alert but relaxed, not rigid. And you may notice it's easiest for you to sense your breath in your nose, feeling the air move in and out of your nostrils, or possibly in your chest, your lungs, or your belly, rising and falling, or just a sense of your whole body expanding and contracting as you breathe in and out. So just whatever that is for you, just rest your awareness there for a few moments. And as you do notice your mind wander off into thoughts or worries, just simply notice that and then anchor yourself back into the present by gently guiding your attention back to your breath. And just take a few final moments to settle into your body and your breath, following your breath all the way in and all the way out. And then as you're ready, just start to bring gentle movement into your body. Open your eyes if you close them. Just reorient yourself to the room while continuing to settle into your physical body and into this space. So thank you all again for being here and for coming into presence with us. Rick, you can go ahead and start the PowerPoint and go to the second slide, the roadmap, and I'll kind of give a brief overview of what we're hoping to accomplish today, what we're hoping to cover, and there will be time at the end, of course, for any questions. So I want to start with just giving a brief definition of what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. And then, so we have some baseline of, what does this even mean? And then look at some of the direct impacts of the current COVID crisis in terms of trauma, so the potentially traumatic impacts that this is causing in different ways, how this current crisis is evoking trauma responses or re-traumatizing people who may have a history of traumatic experiences, and then also considerations for people who are in ongoing interpersonally traumatic situations, so domestic violence, child abuse, and just thinking about the layers of that and what that means in relation to this current situation. And then lastly, I want to spend some time just looking at how can we mitigate some of the potential traumatic impacts. What are some tools that we can use for ourselves and to offer others in order to tend to our nervous systems and counter some of the potentially negative, stressful, or traumatic impacts. So go ahead and go to the next slide and we'll dive into talking about what we mean when we talk about trauma. So what I want to start by saying is just that trauma is in the nervous system. It's not in the event. So it is a nervous system response to a threat. So experiencing a threat or witnessing a threat, an actual threat or a perceived threat, that overwhelms our capacity to cope. So for all of us, you know, evolutionarily, our bodies have an inherent wisdom to be able to respond to threats. You've probably heard it as fight, flight, freeze. And if our bodies are unable to get through that experience and discharge the energy from that threat, then it stays stuck, in a sense, in our nervous system and our bodies. So it's not about just something that you think, you know, you should move on or move past this or get over it. Yeah, just move on. I think it's more of a rewiring of the body, the nervous system, the brain to interpret the world in a different way. So that has really far-reaching impacts. It impacts, again, our physiology, our brain activities and structures, brain development. So when trauma happens in children, the brain development that is happening during that time is impacted. Our physical health and our immune system, our moods, our ability to regulate emotions, our behaviors, our relationships, right? So there's these really far-reaching impacts that are really embedded in our bodies and brains from traumatic experiences. And I want to share this brief definition from Stacy K. Hines. It says, trauma is an experience, series of experiences, and or impacts from social conditions that break or betray our inherent need for safety, belonging, and dignity. And I think it's really important that we highlight that it's a threat not only to our life or our physical safety, but that sense of belonging and dignity that are also inherent human needs. And that's, again, especially relevant during this time as we're seeing those things being threatened in various ways for different people and groups of people. So an example, thinking about a child whose parents repeatedly calls them names, shames them, humiliates them, berates them, where maybe their physical safety is never threatened, but absolutely their sense of love and belonging and dignity is, and that can absolutely be traumatizing. So essentially, what's important to know going forward is that experiences of trauma impair our threat response system so that we are more sensitive to threats. We may see threat when an actual threat isn't there. And that, again, is impacting how people are going to respond to this current moment based on their own history and internal resources. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I want to share this kind of long quote, but I think it's really important, again, to this situation. Oh, I lost my screen. Sorry. Okay. So this is from Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who is really considered one of the leading experts in the trauma field. He wrote a great book called The Body Keeps the Score. And it says, when I give presentations on trauma and trauma treatment, participants sometimes ask me to leave out the politics and confine myself to talking about neuroscience and therapy. I wish I could separate trauma from politics, but as long as we continue to live in denial and treat only trauma while ignoring its origins, we are bound to fail. In today's world, your zip code, even more than your genetic code, determines whether you will lead a safe and healthy life. People's income, family structure, housing, employment, and educational opportunities affect not only their risk of developing traumatic stress, but also their access to effective help to address it. Poverty, unemployment, inferior schools, social isolation, widespread availability of guns, and substandard housing are all breeding grounds for trauma. Trauma breeds further trauma. Hurt people hurt other people. And as we see, obviously, during this time, people are not being equally impacted, right? So the virus itself might not discriminate, but certainly people's social conditions and systems that impact people's vulnerability. So that's important. You know, obviously Jeff Bezos is not being impacted in the same way as someone who's living paycheck to paycheck and that next paycheck's not coming, or the grocery store worker or the teacher, right? So we're all being impacted differently, and it's just really important that we're keeping people's context in mind. And we'll talk more about that as we go. But I wanted to introduce that context. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I want to start by looking at some of the direct impacts. So it's, again, stressful for everyone, and there are a lot of potentially traumatic direct impacts for different people. So with trauma being rooted in this overwhelming experience of helplessness and powerlessness, of not being safe, of not being in charge of one's own life. Anything that is happening now is going to be based on, like, our response to what's happening now is going to be based on our history of those experiences. So our response to any traumatic experience, including various aspects of the current crisis, is determined by the degree of safety and support that we receive. So that could be from, and that's before, during, and after. The degree of support we receive from family, from friends, from our workplace, from political leaders, and also our internal resources. And that has a lot to do with developmental level and, again, our own personal histories. And so I want to introduce this idea of emotional inflammation, because while not all of us are being traumatized, I think we are all experiencing some degree of what Dr. Leif van Susteren calls emotional inflammation, which is just kind of a nervous system in a heightened state where we may be more irritable, we may be more anxious, we may be more worried, we may have trouble sleeping, or we may be shutting down, sleeping too much, right? So there's a variety of responses, but all kind of have this heightened collective sense of stress right now. And then beyond that, some of the direct impacts, thinking about people who are losing or have a fear of losing their livelihoods, their jobs, their businesses, loss of just normalcy, loss of connection, loss of a general sense of safety and security, both on a micro and macro level. So personally, right, like not knowing what's going to happen with our jobs or our families or our future. We may be worried about loved ones being infected or ourselves being infected. And then also on a macro level, right, like not knowing what's going to happen in our world, what's going to happen to the economy, what's going to happen politically. How is this all going to play out, you know, next month, in the fall, next year? So just that sense of uncertainty and unpredictability, and that's all contributing to that sense of emotional inflammation, right? Certainly for me, I've noticed like I have to work to continue to be patient and present with my toddler and present with my work, right? Like I just feel this heightened sense of anxiety. And then people, obviously, there is a direct threat to actual life. So people are getting seriously ill and people are dying and people are being hospitalized and dying without being with their loved ones. And then healthcare workers, I think, is its own category in the sense that they are being exposed to, particularly on the front lines working with COVID patients, being exposed to the threat of the illness, and seeing that in their patients, being worried about their own safety, possibly that of their families, not being able to help patients in the way that they'd like to, right? So there's a lot of witnessing and experienced direct threat there. And then lastly, I want to talk about the ways that this pandemic is highlighting some of the just traumatic fault lines and basic inequities in our society. And again, the ways that that threatens the sense of belonging and dignity on an ongoing basis and is particularly being highlighted now. So we are seeing a lot of health disparities being laid bare. So racial inequalities, particularly disproportionate impacts on Black and Indigenous populations. I think just the other day, the most recent statistic I heard is that Black people make up 4.6% of the population in Colorado and are currently 7.6% of COVID cases. So, and Indigenous people are being disproportionately impacted. And that all those health disparities have always been present, right? And have to do with historical trauma, have to do with social conditions, have to do with access to resources, to food, to housing. So there's all these bigger things contributing to those health disparities, and we're seeing that play out now. We are also seeing, for example, an increase in violence and racism toward Asian Americans. We are seeing the impacts on people experiencing homelessness who are already very vulnerable and continue to be very vulnerable. There are LGBTQ people who are stuck at home with families that may be unsupportive and are not as able to access their community, their supports. And again, so that sense of belonging and dignity is being hurt. So that's all to say that there are certain populations that are disproportionately impacted and have less access to resources. And we can go ahead and move to the next one for now. So this next piece I want to talk about is ways that the current situation is evoking trauma responses for people who already have a history of trauma. So for all of us, our responses to what's happening in the present depends on what's happening externally, what's happening internally, and what's happening internally has everything to do with our past experiences. So we all have kind of a default stress response. So that may be anger and irritability, it may be defensiveness, it may be shutting down, it may be chronic busyness or perfectionism, it may be mistrust and isolation. So all of those, we're bringing all of our experiences. And so people with histories of traumatic experiences are having their default stress responses triggered more rapidly and to a greater extent, because people with a history of traumatic experiences have that exaggerated threat response, what Dr. Bessel van der Kolk calls the smoke detector, right? So essentially there's an overactive smoke detector that is going off even when it doesn't need to. So anytime there is a genuine threat, as there is in the case of COVID, that will just exacerbate that innate sense of threat and that hyperactive smoke detector. And I wanted to show this window of tolerance graphic. So this basically is showing that between those two lines, we all have a zone of stress and emotion that we're able to maintain regulation and just continue forward, even if it gets a little bit challenging and there's ups and downs. And then we all have a point at which it overwhelms our capacity to cope and we go out of our window of tolerance into either hyperarousal, which may look like hypervigilance, panic, anxiety, irritability, anger, or hypoarousal, where we may be more numb, shut down, not taking care of ourselves, isolating. And people with a history of traumatic experiences have a smaller window of tolerance, so they have less capacity to tolerate affect, tolerate stress, tolerate emotion, and it takes less for them to be triggered out of that window of tolerance. So that's really important if people already have a really small window of tolerance based on their own histories, and then this current situation is triggering them, adding stress on top of that, that they are more likely to go out of their own window of tolerance. And for everyone, our usual ways that we can cope, access support, distract ourselves from our traumas are less available. So trauma responses are more likely to show up, right? So we can't go to the bar and have a beer. We can't go to the movies. We can't go meet a friend. We can't go to our meetings or our yoga classes or whatever the case may be, at least not in the same way. So without those resources or distractions or whatever they may be, there's going to be an increase in trauma responses. That might be an increase in post-traumatic stress symptoms, suicidality, increase in substance use and self-harm, depression and anxiety. So all these ways that responses based on from our past experiences are going to show up now when that stress response is being triggered. And then the last piece I want to talk about is just the ways that it's compounding previous trauma and loss for some people. So people that have already experienced a lot of loss in their life and lose a loved one or worry about losing a loved one, right? Again, that threat response, that stress response is being activated. Or for example, thinking about a child who's in foster care who has a history of instability, of abandonment, just unpredictability in their life. And then this happens and they don't have access to the routine of school and the rhythm of school and their teachers. And so though it might not be a conscious thought of, my teachers are abandoning me or my life is unpredictable, right? The body is responding and the adults that are normally in my life are not here. My world is still unstable and unpredictable. And so trauma responses come up just from that body and that nervous system remembrance. So we are not, in general, just not as flexible with our responses when there's a history of trauma. We're not able to adapt and deal with stress in the same way.
Catherine, if I may, and I'll hold my question till later, but I just really want to say how much that resonates with me, having lived in New York City during 9/11 and being through that experience and how it relates to now and looking at this scale that you have in front of me of where I would land. I just appreciate you acknowledging that. And I just kind of wanted to put that out there to help people understand maybe the context of where I'm feeling it, because I'm honest enough to admit that, but where others may be as well. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. It just highlights, right? The ways we're all bringing our own experiences. Thank you.
Yes. And
you can go ahead and go to the next. So this piece, I just want to talk about some considerations for people who are in ongoing interpersonally traumatic situations. So in general, I think it will be a while before we have data on this from the current crisis, but we do know from past studies that child abuse and neglect tend to track with greater traumatic events, economic instability, and stress. And obviously those things are greater right now, all of those things, traumatic events, economic instability, and stress. And so just being aware that children who are unsafe at home with school closures are less safe right now, with more stressed caregivers. Parents and caregivers might be less available. So they may be working from home and unable to tend to their children. They may be working out of the home and not accessing childcare. There may be a lack of supervision. A lot of parents are having their own traumatic experiences triggered. So they may be having an increase in mental health symptoms and substance use disorder symptoms. And so they have a lot of added stress and less access to support to manage it. And then, let's see, thinking about domestic violence, which in general we know thrives on isolation. So with increased isolation, with movement restrictions, violence may be more frequent, more severe, more dangerous. And again, less access to support, less ability to escape, right? So all those pieces are kind of amplified right now. And so part of this is just knowing that for some folks, there are going to be some really long-term mental health and trauma impacts from this situation. And in the meantime, to the greatest extent possible for all of us, just maintaining contacts with folks and reaching out, and as much as possible, making resources known. So hotlines, child abuse hotline, domestic violence hotline, making sure that people are aware of the resources that are available and encouraging them to use them. Because I know, for example, there's been a decrease in calls to the child abuse hotline because children aren't accessing adults that they normally would, that would be mandated reporters that might recognize any concerning signs or symptoms. So just making sure that people are aware of the resources that are there. So through media, social media, whatever ways that we can get the word out, making sure that people know about that. And then we can go ahead and move on. So this piece I want to spend a fair bit of time talking about is what can we do to mitigate some of these impacts, potential traumatic impacts, stressful impacts. So this can be tools that we use for ourselves and also to offer to support other people, and are just helpful across any continuum of, nervous system regulation, whether or not we are directly experiencing trauma or being re-traumatized. So in general, overcoming the impacts of trauma consists of relearning, reestablishing a sense of safety, so physical and social safety, and also reinstating our capacity to be in charge of our lives and take effective action. So some of the things that we can do are just tend to our nervous system in some really basic ways. And a huge one is connection. And obviously the circumstances dictate that we need to distance from people. You may have heard some mental health professionals or other people use physical distancing rather than social distancing, because I think while we need to physically distance, we need to remain socially close in whatever ways that we can. So as far as connection, one thing that really sticks with me, and this comes from a guy named Dr. Stephen Porges, is that safety doesn't come from a lack of threat, it comes from connection. So safety comes from connection. Connection is a biological imperative. We all need it. We do not survive as a species without it. So in this time, thinking about how can we find safe connection, and that may be with our families or roommates if we're living with people, for I'm maintaining contact with friends and family through technology, particularly through video or phone when possible, because we actually co-regulate each other's physiology and emotions. So seeing someone's face and hearing someone's voice is actually a reassuring safety cue for our nervous systems. And also, finding online groups that whether it's book club or yoga or AA meetings, right? Ways to connect with other people however we can. I will say, while seeing someone's face and hearing their voice is ideal, if that is not possible, or either because it's not accessible or because someone does not want to connect that way, I currently work with middle and high school students, and I do have a few that either don't have access to video or phone, or just aren't interested, that's weird, I don't want to be on video, right? And so still, however you can, reaching out and just maintaining contact so that at least people know someone is thinking about them, someone cares about them, right? So texting or email or social media, whatever is possible to make sure that we're maximizing connection, and we have a lot of technology available to do that. And then the next piece is agency. So again, with trauma, our sense of agency disappears. It's an experience of helplessness, of powerlessness. And so being able to bring a sense of agency back into our bodies and into our lives by doing just realistic, small things at regular intervals throughout the day, so that we feel our bodies able to take immediate effective action in our own lives. So that might be going for a walk, that might be cooking a meal, creating something, singing, dancing, moving, right? Whatever we can do, writing, whatever is realistic and accessible for us to have some sense of immediate agency and power in our lives. And I just want to be clear that that's not to say we need to try to be productive and starting new projects and learning new things. I think that messaging can be really harmful, because again, we're all under some stress and have less capacity. And so when I think just being realistic about what are small things that we can do, not that I need to start a new business and learn something, just start something big, but just ways to feel a sense of immediate power and agency. And then this last piece is predictability, structure, and rhythms. So again, trauma creates just a timeless sense of helplessness, and so much in the world is unpredictable right now. So whatever we can do to structure our lives, to our day, just to have, it doesn't need to be rigid, but to have rhythms to our day, to have consistent meal times, consistent sleeping schedules. You know, at 9 o'clock every morning, I'm going to go for a walk, or, you know, waking up and making my cup of coffee, going to sleep at the same time. Just really creating as much structure and predictability as we're able to in our immediate sphere, in our days, to counter that sense of unpredictability that is characteristic of trauma, not knowing what's going to happen. And a lot is unpredictable right now. So focusing on what do we have control over and how can we work with that. And then this next piece is just limiting media exposure. So if we are overexposed and spend too much time with media, it can actually increase our anxiety, our panic, or just distract us from how are we actually experiencing this time? What do we need? You know, tending to our nervous system and our bodies, it can serve as a distraction. And really, you know, it's important to have like factual, up-to-date information, but in general, we can get that relatively quickly in a day. And I'm certainly guilty of this. Like, I'll have public radio on for hours. I'll read 10 different articles and scroll through Twitter at night. And, you know, I just being aware of like, when is this helpful for me? And when is this heightening my anxiety or distracting me instead of tending to myself and my own experience? This is a big one and kind of general, but important to think about making resources available, known, and accessible. So how can people access food? How can people access unemployment? How can people access physical and mental health care, child care? So this is so, you know, multi-level effort from individuals and community groups and agencies and institutions and governments, but thinking about how we can connect people with resources and making sure that they're able to navigate them and making sure that they're available when they're not, advocating that they become available, advocating for policies that help people and that lessen the threat to their safety, belonging, and dignity. And then this piece is, I think, just always important, no matter where we are or what we're experiencing, is to not make yourself wrong for however you're reacting, to just allow your experiences and recognize the ways that your system is trying to take care of you, and not being judgmental or beating yourself up or thinking you should feel a different way. So like for me, I notice like I'm snacking a lot. I always want to be eating all day, right? And so just instead of judging that, just noticing it and saying that's, you know, my system's way of telling me something's going on and I'm anxious. And so what can I do to tend to that? And the more we're able to just accept what we're feeling and accept whatever our experience is, then the more flexible we'll be with our response, rather than just going, you know, I need to have a beer or I need to do whatever. We'll actually have more flexibility if we can just be accepting of however we're experiencing this. And then the next piece is connection. In addition to connection with other people, connecting with our body, connecting with our physical environment. So when possible, going outside, going for a walk, going for a bike ride. And also just, again, connecting with our own experience, our own body, grounding, breathing. There's all kinds of apps that can be helpful for that. Insight Timer, Calm, Headspace. So whatever ways we can help ourselves connect to our own experience and accept our own experience, connect to our own body, is going to be helpful just for our own regulation. And then this last piece is finding meaning. So that's an important part of trauma treatment, is finding meaning. And that can mean a lot of different things. And so this is an ongoing process. And I think even in the midst of it, something that we can be practicing. And that does not mean negating or skipping over or denying anything that's hard about this, but just finding ways that we can find meaning, like ways that we can be more grateful, ways that we can be more present, or recognize what it is about our pre-COVID lives that wasn't working, individually or collectively, or increasing our spirituality, using this just as an opportunity to get in touch with our vulnerable humanity, to learn some truth about ourselves, about other people, learn how to be with ourselves and others in stressful situations, right? Like, what are things that we can do even in the midst of stress, and not to make that go away or negate it, but to also find some positives and meanings and carry those with us. And on that note, I want to end with another short exercise, and then I will open it up for questions. So wherever you are, go ahead and come back to a comfortable seat, upright but relaxed, not rigid. And take just a moment to anchor yourself back with your breath, just noticing your natural breath. And then just see what comes to mind for you when you ask yourself, what is one positive thing that I'm taking from this experience so far, the whole experience of this COVID crisis? And again, not denying any of the hard stuff. So what is one positive thing that I want to carry with me as we move forward? So maybe that's building a stronger relationship with a child or a dog. Maybe it's a new sense of gratitude or appreciation for what other people do, the work that other people do. And whatever it is for you, whatever comes to mind, just really feel that settle into your body. And carry that with you as we continue to navigate the stressful time, because we have a long road ahead. It may be helpful to bring one hand to your heart and one hand to your belly. And again, just feeling whatever that thing is for you, that small piece of meaning, settle into your body. And then as you're ready, bring yourself back into the physical space you're in, reorient to the room. And then I think we are ready to open it for questions.
Okay. I don't see any questions right now in the chat. I do have something from Rini Samard, who said, "Thank you, Catherine, for some great recommendations as we all navigate through these challenging times." So he wanted to say thank you. He had to drop off. I am going to unmute Dee Dee Poole's microphone as we speak, because she might have some comments or questions as well. But I just have to say personally, wow, I'm so grateful that I can call you my colleague, and I really valued the information you just shared. And I actually do have a question then for myself. Having gone through something traumatic before and then seeing kind of where I fall, I think I fall more on the hypo-arousal piece of that, dealing with stress. Is there anything more? What skills do you look for that? Do I need to work harder at those skills to try and pull myself back? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how it's showing up for you, but that hypoarousal, again, anything you can do to bring your nervous system up. So physical movement, and it doesn't have to be intense workouts, but moving your body physically. If you can go for a walk or a bike ride or do some stretching, just kind of expanding your body, waking up physically. And then also that connection piece, right? 'Cause a lot of times in hypoarousal, we withdraw, we shut down. And so it's harder to reach out. So making sure that either you are reaching out or you have people that are reaching out to you and checking in on you so that you are maintaining that sense of connection. I know for you, you're a very social person, right? So that is extra important right now that you're tending to that need and that piece of you
Very much so.
in order to maintain your connection.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you, because you do kind of know me. I am very social, so it does force me into that. And I find that I love physical exercise. I was a professional dancer. I love getting out there, but it's harder to get over that hump of forcing me to do it, and even more so these days. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I do have a question here from Paul, I think. If someone with significant pre-existing PTSD many times thinks no one can understand their issues, and so won't use, for example, crisis lines in exacerbated situations, how to get help to them? If there's somebody that basically wouldn't reach out, how do we get help to them?
Yeah, it's very tricky. And honestly, I think there will be a lot of people that are missed because of that. I think the biggest thing is that we are maintaining contact however we can, and that the people, so if you have someone like that in your life, that you are making an effort to reach out to them, just to be in contact and encourage their use of resources, and also normalizing however possible, right, that there are a lot of people in this situation. There are groups available online, there is mental health support, and a group may be particularly helpful if they are feeling alone in that experience, in order to recognize that there are other people experiencing not the same thing, because everyone's experience is unique, but certainly similar things. If you know of someone like that, then certainly making sure that you're maintaining contact and that they're aware of the resources and you're encouraging that and normalizing. But ultimately, we cannot force anything. And if we don't know about them, if we don't know that that person
Correct.
is experiencing that, then we can't reach them. So I think just, again, coming back to that, making things available and known and accessible, and then our own personal efforts to maintain contact. And I know that that's not enough, and I think that's what we can do and continue to try to do.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. I did go ahead and put in the chat line for everyone. I want to let you know that I put in our main number, 303-617-2300. That is Aurora Mental Health Center's main line. We also have a live person available 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. through our support line. So if you call the main line number, I think in the daytime you have to press 5, in the afternoon you press 4. I'm not sure how that works, but just listen to the prompts and you will be connected to a live person on our support line. And that might help in answering this question a little bit. It's just support. It's you don't even have to be open to our system or to Aurora Mental Health. You don't even have to be actively seeking treatment. It's just a support line to get people over the hump. Just saying, hey, whatever the case may be, I'm down today or whatever. So there is no connection there whatsoever, just the support line to help people out. And then they can also reach us on our website. I don't know if you work on the support line, Catherine, or not. I don't know if you've been pulled into that, but
I have a couple times, yeah.
Okay. But yeah, my understanding is it does not matter what your funding stream is. It's just there just to talk to somebody with complete anonymity. And
I think that's a nice option, in that it's not a crisis line, if there's some stigma around that, but it's just availability of support for like any range of experiences.
Right. Dee Dee, do you have any comments or questions at this point? I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat line.
I do. So my one question and then comment to follow. So this point in time for some people has been really awesome, where we are able to self-reflect and take more time for ourselves and exercise and eat right and do some maybe necessary cleaning that's been sitting to the side. And instead of, giving our leftovers, as one person explained it in other webinars, to our families, we're now able to give more attention to ourselves and to them. My worry personally is when we start back to work at our regularly scheduled hours and we're sitting in traffic for 2 to 3 hours a day. What can you suggest to sustain that? Because my fear is that I'm going to lose it again, and then I'm going to get back to not taking care of myself and not exercising and not eating right and back to giving my family my leftovers. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And at the beginning, I mentioned, that idea of emotional inflammation, and that I think our society in general kind of promotes that condition of being anxious, of, hearing the news all the time, commuting, working long hours, overworking. And I think this, again, is a good opportunity for us to reflect on what parts of our lives were working and what parts were not, and how we want to do things differently. How we hold on to that, I think, is another question. I think part of that will be dictated by circumstances and policies and, supportive workplaces, and how we move forward individually and collectively. But I think in general, like noticing right now, taking stock of what is the meaning making for you, what are the positive takeaways, and noticing how those are impacting you and how important those are. And I know, in the best of times, a lot of times we know that, and it's still, there's just a lot of reasons that it's hard to practice. So
Right.
it's a matter of holding on to that and setting boundaries where you can, and really prioritizing like what is important to you. Like for me, I'm like, I don't want my son to be at daycare for like really long days. So how can I, to the extent that I have control over, shape my life around being intentional with my time with him? And that's ongoing work, right? It's ongoing practice, and it's not a simple fix. But I think you just recognizing all of the positive impacts that these things are having on you now is a really good start, so that you can start to do what you can to structure your life around holding on to those important things.
Right. Yeah, it's a matter of what's become more important, right? Yeah.
I have a question in the chat line that just came in.
Oh, wonderful.
All right. So Catherine, many people in trouble are afraid to call crisis lines, possibly being afraid of being locked up or what have you. What is the process for AUMHC's practice? So I guess maybe we can break that down a little bit. What if I was to call in crisis? What would that process look like, maybe?
So I think a trained clinician would work with whoever's calling to figure out what is most appropriate. And that should not be jumping to, getting anyone involved that doesn't need to be, just to making sure that they have access to support and not punishment or anything that's going to further harm the situation, but what is actually needed in that moment. And I think reducing stigma and fear and making people aware that this is there to support you and not to it's not going to lead to you getting in trouble, but to make sure that you're safe, that's why it's there, and that's what its purpose. So I think, it sounds like that's just a matter of like education and awareness and destigmatizing in terms of what is the purpose of the crisis support line.
I think you've used the term a couple of times, and normalizing that it's not the old mindset mentality of what it's like to call a crisis line.
Right.
Essentially, if you call crisis, you're anonymous in a way until they start taking some billing information and stuff like that, is my understanding. But the focus is just assessing kind of where the person's at from a trained clinician standpoint, correct?
Correct. Yep. And what they need, and collaborating to get those needs met.
Okay. And so assessing that call and that crisis situation, is it fair to say that maybe getting them in for individual therapy might be a step?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is a very low level entry type thing. Still a lot of anonymity. Obviously we have a lot of HIPAA, disclosure around this and keeping people's privacy. So I hope that the listeners feel comfortable hearing that. But then also hearing the flip side. If I was to call you right now, Catherine, and essentially be in a very crisis heightened situation, what would potentially qualify me for going inpatient somewhere? Just so people can kind of understand what that might look like.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, really that's just if there is an immediate danger or you are gravely disabled, so you are not able to function and take care of yourself and keep yourself safe in really basic ways, like that there, even no matter what we put in place, that I still didn't feel that you could be safe, then that would be the only circumstance where a higher level of care would be warranted. So in general, the goal is to keep people at as low a level care as possible while making sure that they have all the support that they need. But we don't want anyone to go into a higher level of care than they need.
Right.
That's never the goal. So unless there's an immediate danger that cannot be addressed with whatever supports are available in that person's life and through mental health resources otherwise, then that would be the only time.
Gotcha. Okay. So if I was definitely, if you still felt I was a harm to myself and or to others, basically.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Awesome. I hope that answers the question for the person who posed it to me. And if it doesn't, please let me know. And I know we have
I would just say that, this is Paul. I would just say that what I normally get, I help facilitate some mental health support groups. And when we give out the numbers, and we all carry the numbers with us to people, they say, if I call, they're going to figure out where I am and they're going to put me under a 72-hour hold. And it's just ridiculous to call because the people just stall you until they have a chance to get you locked up. And typically now, as we know, with not enough beds in a mental health area, particularly now with COVID, it's more likely to be a police station where you get taken. And so normalizing is a great word to say, but as you said, very tricky and a real challenge to pull off. And I just wondered if you'd had any specific experience with that to give us some ideas on what normalizing and reassurance would look like, when I know that your people are trained and should be, that if somebody sounds like they may hurt themselves, then they probably do need to get put on a 72-hour hold.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, again, like only in those circumstances. And I think also making people aware of just the number that Rick put down, the general Aurora mental health number, if they are not wanting to call crisis, just to start there and see where that leads, right? If they're just looking for some, like getting connected to services, and unless they are, if they are wanting or needing something more, then absolutely, someone's going to make sure that they get that. But I think just, unfortunately, there's not a lot of other options. You can call the general number and access support in that way if that's going to be enough. You can call the crisis line and get support to work through whatever the immediate crisis is and get connected with services. And then if the genuine assessment is that something more is needed in order to keep them safe, then it will move that way. And I think it's important to people that people know that, but only in those circumstances. That's not the starting point, and that's not the goal.
Great, thanks. That's very helpful.
Thank you, Catherine, very much. We're at time right now. We're at a little 1 minute after 3. Dee Dee, do you have any final comments or anything before we end this session?
Just a big thank you to you and Catherine. As always, we appreciate your time, your expertise, and for agreeing to help us to get the word out and to help our members during these trying times. So we're very grateful. We will be back here next Friday at 2 o'clock. Rick, do you want to talk a little bit about the discussion that we're going to be focusing on then?
I will do that. I'm going to pull it up real quick because I'm
sorry.
That's okay. Because I don't have that spreadsheet up in front of me. So next week, it's going to be on substance use and how that applies to you know, what people are going through with COVID-19 right now in isolation, and that's going to be presented to us by Malcolm Jobe, who works at our East Metro Detox facility. And we're very excited to have him speaking to us, as we know that this can be a very challenging time for individuals who are currently in recovery or thinking about going to recovery, and the isolation does not help that in terms of, you know, being able to access resources, whether it's a AA meeting or typical ongoing recovery, you know, groups or something that they may access. So I know he will have a lot more resources probably on how to navigate that than I do, but I look forward to his discussion next week, next Friday.
Thank you so much.
Well,
Well, thank you everybody for attending. We hope to see you at next week's webinars. You can go onto our calendar at the Chamber of Commerce so that you can see the different webinars we're having. We're also working on getting a webinar together with AD Works so that people can get answers to their questions about unemployment and other resources that they have available. And if you want to also look on our website for all the other webinars and resources that we have, our communications director has done a phenomenal job getting all of the information we've been sending over to her on there for all the different resources. It's just a slew of information that we have on there for you. So, and if you have any particular topics that you would like to hear us talk about, please feel free to email that to me, or just shoot me an email and then we can talk. I'll call you from my cell. My email is dd.poole@aurorachamber.org. So it's DEEDEE.P as in Papa, OOLE @aurorachamber.org, and let us know what you like to talk about. And you know, I think the first step in getting help is realizing that we need help, and just because at times we're feeling a little helpless, you know, shouldn't deter us from getting the help that we need to get over this hump. And sometimes it's just, you know, talking to somebody and walking through it, like Catherine said, so that we can see what our next steps are going to be. But thank you, everybody. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Rick. Thank you to all your attendees. I wish you all a safe and well weekend. It's going to be beautiful outside. Hopefully you'll be able to get out and enjoy some of the outdoors and use those breathing exercises that Catherine walked us through today. That's really amazing. I feel very relaxed. I was supposed to go cut the grass when I got off of work today, but I don't know that that's going to happen now.
So
thank you all for having this and having me and being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay safe and healthy, everyone. Thank you so much.
Okay, have a good weekend.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.